The Homo sapien has always desired a good time, one way or another. Whether it's indulging in culture, spending time with loved ones, engaging in thrills, enjoying sex, getting high, living out desires, and whatever else may tickle one's fancy, you can be sure that man has lived under the adage of work hard, play hard since the first early hominids developed sapiens, though of course, some have always preferred to play harder, maybe even too hard if there is such a thing. Drugs have been around for as long as there's in biodiversity. After all a drug is a substance that affects one's physiological or psychological function, and so while maybe there weren't any ankylosaur going around getting geeked off toxic plants on purpose, the creatures of the past most certainly would ingest plants, or even animals if that affected their being one way or another, on purpose or not, just like how they do today. Of course though, by the time that any hominid came to be, there are already countless organisms, aquatic or terrestrial, available to consume in the pursuit of having fun, which you better bet they took full advantage of. Our relationship with drugs has obviously evolved as we developed as a species, from the first early primates hanging out in trees getting drunk off rotting fruit, to early humans tripping off shrooms under the natural night sky, to smokers inhaling opium in smoke-filled dens, to ravers pill-popping in the club to the music, to students hitting flavored nitrous oxide on the school bus, and everything outside and in between. We've always enjoyed our recreation. It's from this fundamental relationship I hope to establish a very rough timeline of the proclivities of our ancestors, as well as the order in which us modern-day folk were introduced to contemporary drugs. And how better to begin such an assessment than that the very most accessible drugs early hominids would have had no problems obtaining and enjoying. While there were a wide variety of naturally occurring substances at the disposal of our predecessors, it's hard to find concrete evidence of usage for obvious reasons. That said, we can still build a general timeline of discovery and consumption using both indirect and direct evidence of these very early recreations. The earliest drug intake would have occurred in the Old World, obviously. Working from that fact, it's more than likely that the first means of rejecting sobriety came in the form of easily accessible alcohol from fermenting vegetation, or naturally occurring plants such as magic mushrooms, which are prevalent throughout the entire world with the exception of the Antarctic. We know of primates today who enjoy getting drunk off rotting fruit with ethanol content approaching 2%, sometimes to the point alcoholism, so at least in my opinion, it's safe to say that alcohol is probably the first recreational drug. While it was originally believed that alcoholic beverages only came after the advent of civilization, such as in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, somewhat recent evidence proves that people are getting socially lubricated far before the agricultural revolution, and not necessarily due to just simple cultivation of fermenting fruits, but rather relatively advanced process to make full-ass proto-beer. The very earliest evidence we have of beer consumption comes from the Levant. After stone mortars were discovered in the Raqefet cave near what is today Haifa, Israel, analysis was performed which concluded that the artifacts were indeed used in service of alcohol production, ultimately placing the practice to be 13,000 years at the very minimum. Though to clarify, while I may be calling these early alcohols a beer, in reality they are more akin to an organic sludge which I imagine had to be choked down. Another curious example of beer production comes from the Göbekli Tepe site in southeastern Turkey. Strangely, the Göbekli Tepe isn't an early Neolithic site. Instead, it seems it was once a sanctuary for cult activity. Dating back to as early as 8,000 to 9,500 BC, the site once held infrastructure including a somewhat complex water supply system, as well as simple tooling and manufacturing capabilities. Though most notably about the site is the art and architecture present. Several monuments and pillars are adorned with cultic symbolism, and the buildings once present have been found to contain a great deal of artistry in the form of sculptures and carvings, not to mention the amount of intentionally placed skull fragments found, indicating it was a cult which revered death in however way. And one more quick thing about this, it seems like the site was only one of many for the same cult, with the same symbolism and artistic through-lines found at nearby sites. While the Göbekli Tepe could be an entire video in of itself, what's relevant for this matter is that excavated evidence, while maybe not directly, it does indeed strongly indicate the production of beer, likely used in ceremonial practices, especially considering the presumed purpose of the site. The point being, alcohol production was likely occurring far before we could ever know, and mind you, we're only talking about crude alcoholic beverages. More refined and perhaps dignified means of consuming ethanol would come later, but we'll get to that soon. Likewise with alcohol consumption, it's impossible to truly date when humans, or even early hominids, began to take naturally occurring drugs, such as psychedelics like the magic mushroom. While it's likely that humans have consumed psychoactive substances since the beginning of time, on accident or purpose, we do have evidence that dates psychedelic usage to be at the very least 12,000 years old, thanks to a wonderful cave painting found in northern Australia, which depicts humanoid mushroom figures alongside other wacky drawings that were surely created under the influence. While this is the oldest evidence we have of magic mushroom madness, it's safe to say that humans have been tripping since the dawn of time, thanks to the ubiquity of shrooms, as well as their barrier of entry being only that of ingestion. There's even a theory, the stone date theory, which posits that perhaps the consumption of shrooms was one of, if not the factor that spurred about early human cognitive development, though this theory is very much disputed by the scientific community and remains as a fun possibility. And while my opinion on the matter certainly doesn't matter, I'd like to think that while magic mushrooms probably didn't trigger the emergence of sapiens and humans the same way that eating cooked meat probably did, it probably helped spur about greater cerebral function, such as greater engagement with art and culture. Shrooms aren't the only naturally occurring drug in the old world that were likely enjoyed as early as they were discovered. Another example is that of betel nuts. Also known as the areca nut, these fruits are prevalent in South to East Asia, as well as the Pacific Islands, and when chewed, deliver a stimulant effect, and depending on the dosage in person, narcotic effects. The thing, though, is that chewing betel nuts comes with a whole host of nasty side effects, including the permanent staining of teeth into a deep red color, reminiscent of fresh blood. Because of so, we're able to determine that its usage was occurring as early as 4,600 years ago, when characteristically stained teeth were found in a burial pit in the Duyong Cave of the Philippines. There is some evidence that places the habit to be well over 13,000 years old, but such conclusions are disputed. Just like with magic mushrooms and alcohol and all other old world drugs available, it's impossible to date when its recreational use began. While mankind was relegated to only the most accessible of intoxicants during this time endemic to the Old World, in due time, hunter-gatherers would make their way to the New World through the once present land bridges. While the time of man's arrival to the New World is unknown, at the very least 16,000 years old, although recent evidence does suggest that the more accurate time frame is likely twice that, what we do know is that their arrival meant a whole new environment man had not seen before. New geography, new challenges, new plant and wildlife, and by extension, new drugs, and a lot more at that. Once again, this is a matter of where it's difficult to date even a rough time of when such plants are being consumed recreationally, though at least in my belief, it can be surmised that these were being taken as soon as their effects were discovered. Perhaps maybe not 100% recreationally like we may envision today, such as for the purpose of cultural or ritualistic practices, but consumed for its effects nonetheless. There is an entire swath of plants that will induce a trip or high of some kind in the New World, so we'll do a rapid fire round from north to south, in the same order our ancestors would have traversed the land. Exclusive to the Americas, tobacco, and by extension, nicotine, was likely amongst the first substances early natives would have experimented with, and there is evidence to support such a claim. Researchers discovered burnt tobacco seeds in the west desert of Utah, and upon dating their find, determined them to be at least 12,300 years old. The presence of seeds in this area means that early enthusiasts were indeed traveling, or potentially even trading, with these plants. Then there's the actual trip-inducing plants just a bit south in the form of a variety of cacti, including the San Pedro cactus, the Peruvian torch cactus, and most famously, peyote. Now, it's not the actual plants themselves that cause the high, but rather the mescaline within it, which is known for its intense reality distortion, which potentially contributed to the cultural beliefs of the communities who consumed the plant. As usual, these cacti were likely utilized for their psychoactive effects as soon as the first person decided to try a mescaline-containing cactus, but the earliest evidence we have of usage is that of preserved peyote found in two places, the Shumla Caves of southwest Texas, and an archaeological site, once a very humble shelter in Colilla, Mexico, with the samples dated to be roughly 5,160 years and 5,200 years old, respectively. Cacti aren't the only way of experiencing a powerful trip south of the United States border, though. Salvia divinorum, also known as Salvia, is an extremely powerful hallucinogen, among the most potent in the world. And importantly to note, its effects are significantly more erratic than that of more popular psychedelics. Substances like LSD and psilocybin, the ingredient in shrooms that make you trip, tend to offer more pleasant experiences with appropriate usage, whereas salvia is known to induce anywhere from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. That being said, the plant is found in Mexico. While we have zero idea as to when salvia may have been first experimented with, as usual, I believe it's safe to say it was probably soon after man crossed the Rio Grande. And while we're on the topic of extremely potent psychedelics with an ambiguous history of usage, there's Datura, a genus of plants of the nightshade family. Nightshades, of course, infamous for their toxicity. While some Datura plants are found in Europe and in the Mediterranean, the vast majority are concentrated in Central to South America, meaning there are likely countless unlucky individuals who tried the plant, unaware of what they were about to be subjected to. I say so because if I made salvia sound unappealing, the Datura simply operated on a whole other level of depravity. Datura seems to exclusively result in overwhelmingly terrible, soul-crushing trips, regardless of who takes it, so it's no wonder that the plant is also known as Devil's Trumpet. That said, some indigenous tribes have found ways of utilizing the drug through more responsible means, such as for the purpose of culture or spirituality. Passing through Central America into the North to South America, early wayfarers would have discovered the coca leaf. Just like with tobacco, it was more than likely consumed en masse upon its discovery. And in fact, there's a good chance that natives would have gone out of their way to cultivate tobacco alongside coca leaf, so as to consume both at the same time to experience a compounded effect from the mixture. As it was recorded from later European explorers that chewing tobacco and coca at the same time was extremely popular, it would induce great contentment. Of course, people would discover the hidden potential of coca in due time, but until then, people were getting their kicks off just fine with what they had. Then finally, and perhaps the best for last depending on who you ask, is that of the fruits of the Anandenanthera genus, endemic to South America. Those seeking a powerful high would grind the dried fruits into a powder, from which it would be snorted, and the practice proved popular enough for specialized equipment. Pipes were found in a grave in Argentina dating back to 2130 BC, and when analyzed, were found to contain trace amounts of snuff, still preserved, and within that powder, DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which of course is one of the most potent hallucinogens known. DMT is also the reason why ayahuasca is so potent. Ayahuasca is a mixture of many different organic compounds, of which some interact with the DMT to produce the characteristic ayahuasca high. And as a quick fun fact, the research indicates that androgenic DMT is released in the brain upon near death, and is potentially responsible for the powerful experiences people report following a near-death experience. Now that we've covered some of the most accessible of substances that have likely been used since time immemorial, we can finally progress up the timeline to a couple drugs we're all likely familiar with one way or another, opium and marijuana. The two substances, while prevalent like the ones before, did require a little bit of extra work for the purpose of getting high, meaning it likely wasn't used for what we might imagine today right off the bat. For cannabis, the THCA within it is inactive until heated so as to remove the carboxyl group into what gets us high, THC. And another fun fact, the reason why it's called delta 9 THC is because of the presence of the double bond on the 9th carbon, for delta 8 on the 8th carbon, and delta 10 the 10th carbon, and so on. These double bonds affect the stability of the compound, which is why delta 9, a more unstable isomer or variant of THC, produces a stronger high than, say, delta 8, which is much more stable and less eager to bind to your cannabinoid receptors. Since it requires being burned, cannabis was likely utilized for its strength as a fiber long before it was ever used as a drug in the form of hemp, and we have proof of that. The very earliest evidence we have of cannabis usage comes in the form of trace residue left behind from a hemp rope upon pottery, discovered in the Wanshan archaeological site in Taiwan, dating back to roughly 10,000 BC. Also, to clarify, hemp and marijuana are the same plant, cannabis, but hemp has a THC content of less than 0.3%, whereas marijuana or weed has more than 0.3%. While the aforementioned hemp rope traces are the earliest evidence we currently have of cannabis usage, hemp's ubiquity in East Asia during the Neolithic is a well-known fact, where it saw plentiful usage in the form of clothing, equipment like nets and rope, and even Buddha medicine. In fact, it seems humans figured out the medicinal properties of cannabis before its recreational potential. The Abir's Papyrus, the oldest known medical journal in ancient Egypt, which dates back to around 1550 BC, recommends topical application of cannabis oil to soothe inflammation. An effective treatment given the CBD within cannabis, THC is less fun but more chill sibling. The oldest indirect evidence we have of medicinal usage dates back to around 2300 BC, when a grave was found in the Netherlands containing a large concentration of cannabis pollen alongside meadowsweet, indicating a sort of remedy and comfort for someone at the end of their life. There are even bygone tales that the legendary emperor of China, Shennong, or the divine farmer, would brew and distribute cannabis-based teas for a variety of ailments as early as 2737 BC, though such accounts are heavily disputed and believed to be exaggerated, though to what extent remains unknown. That being said, the first direct, irrefutable proof of purposeful THC consumption would come almost 9,500 years after earliest dating of general cannabis usage. Wooden bowls dating back to 500 BC were excavated from a cemetery high up in the mountains of western China, and upon analysis were found to contain significant traces of THC, enough so that the reason was quite obvious. Something important to note is that cannabis at higher altitudes contain more THC, meaning that its recreational use could have been discovered in the mountains of East Asia before being popularized elsewhere. While that's the most direct we can get, it's safe to say that people have been getting high off the devil's lettuce for long before then. The first example of such indirect evidence comes from 800 BC, found in the Judahite shrine in Telerad. Of two altars containing organic residue that were analyzed, one was found with small traces of THC and CBD, potentially indicating some ritual activity involving weed smoke. The other piece of indirect evidence, though my personal favorite, and if you ask me, pretty damn concrete evidence of people getting their kicks off way before we can ever place it, dates back just 50 years after the Telerad example in 750 BC. In the 80s, a grave of a roughly 40 to 45-year-old European man was discovered in the flaming mountains of the Zhejiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In the grave was the man holding a cache of nearly 800 grams, or a little less than 2 pounds, worth of cultivated marijuana with a very high THC content for the time, though such figures still grossly pale compared to what we'd be smoking and eating today. Notably too, of the man's stash was the absence of male plant parts, which is the least potent part of the cannabis plant. Such a discovery indicates an extensive trade of weed throughout the old world, perhaps far before we can ever determine, and that certain strands were selected and prized for their psychoactive effects. And there are some pretty interesting stories of weed usage in BC times. Potentially also my favorite thing to learn of in the research of this video was that of what the Greek historian Herodotus recorded in 480 BC. He noted that recreational marijuana use was more than prevalent in Scythia, which is yet another indication that people are consuming mad marijuana far before we can ever know. In fact, the Scythians loved weed so much that they utilized it in their bathhouses, using the plant to generate the steam that they bathed in. Herodotus noted that the users of these weed-based steam houses were so merry and enthusiastic that they'd often shout for joy, though there are also stories of the steam driving some mad. Mad happy or mad as in crazy, I couldn't tell you, but clearly mad enough that someone felt it important enough to document for posterity. While thousands were enjoying a smooth and chill high across the old world following the discovery of cannabis's psychoactive effects, many other thousands opted for something a little bit stronger, opium. There's plenty of indirect evidence indicating opium's popularity long before the first substantial evidence of recreational usage, the earliest of which comes in the form of poppy seeds found in the underwater archaeological site of Lama Marta in Lake Bacciano, Italy, dated to be from 5700 BC. While this may be the earliest example, there are countless instances of ancient poppy seeds being found throughout Europe and the greater Mediterranean. More importantly, though, is that the clay tablets discovered in Nippur, Iraq, a remnant of the Sumerians who once called the land home. These tablets are the oldest known list of medical prescriptions, and one of the medications appears to document opium poppy as an ingredient, meaning that people were at least somewhat aware of opium's narcotic effects as early as 2200 BC. Alongside the seeds and texts referring to such, there's also countless evidence of people's reverence for the poppy. Several necklaces containing poppy seeds, as well as art depicting the plant in one way or another, have been found, not to mention its presence in numerous spiritual or cult writings. All that said, it's not until 1400 BC that we have the first direct evidence of opium consumption. The Tel Yahed archaeological burial site in Israel, upon a greater excavation, unveiled several ceramic vessels, and when analyzed, traces of straight opium were discovered. And what makes this even more impressive is that while the site was of Canaanite origin, some of the vessels came from Cyprus, strongly indicating that there was indeed a widespread opium trade, just like that of cannabis. And speaking of slightly higher skill tree drugs being unlocked, this very rough period between 7000 and 1000 BC not only saw the advent of opium and weed being used for recreational purposes, but a refinement in ethanol consumption. The earliest evidence we have of alcohol usage in China dates back to 7000 BC in the form of a much more intentional kind of liquor. Previous examples in Neolithic alcohol were significantly more archaic, such as the aforementioned beer sludge. However, the slightly more recent liquor discovered in the Yellow River Valley of China was a bit closer to modern-day sake than the beer then was to today's beer. Its traces were found within pottery of a Neolithic village, and upon analysis, it was determined that the beverage is likely of very high alcohol content, especially for the time, and comprised of rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn fruit. It's also around 7000 BC that we see the first examples of mead come about, yet again in China. Like that of the proto-sake, traces of mead were found within pottery from a Neolithic village, this time located in the Henan province. Easily made from honey and water, mead would go on to be a staple of alcohol, revered in both fiction and reality. And while wine was just right around the corner, its emergence a mere 1,000 years later at most, mead would remain as a delicacy, especially in colder regions. And speaking of wine, it's around 5980 BC when the first evidence of wine production begins to appear. In the country Georgia, several clay vessels were excavated from an archaeological site, and upon analysis, it became abundantly clear that the pottery is meant for the storage of traditional grape wine. Making the discovery even more interesting is that of its prevalence, with these containers of what was once alcohol found across several different sites of varying social status, meaning its consumption was seemingly widespread across class lines. And not to mention, these containers were decorated with art, including more often than not, depictions of jolly men and grapes. There are numerous examples of alcohol from 7000 BC onwards, of which there is a clear trend of the means of ethanol ingestion becoming more palatable with time. That said, it wouldn't be some time before alcohol too came out in the form of spirits, but we'll get to that later. Now that we've gone through the more conventional drugs of our ancestors, we can finally discuss the more unusual measures some people would undertake to get their fix. There are a couple notable examples of many, the first being that of the brains of certain fish, the most popular being the Selima porgy, so popular in fact that it's known as the fish that makes dreams in Arabic. A very popular practice amongst the Romans, drug enthusiasts would consume these fish brains to induce a potent psychedelic experience, reportedly not too dissimilar to LSD. And speaking of acid, the other example I wanted to mention is that of the consumption of ergot fungus, an incredibly poisonous fungus that didn't stop medieval Europeans from purposefully infecting grains with the fungus so as to concoct a brew known as kykeon, which too would produce acid-like effects within the user. Which makes sense, seeing as ergot fungus is quite literally the original starting point of LSD production. And yet another fun fact, some historians believe that the mass hysteria of witches and the subsequent trials in Salem in 1962 were potentially a consequence of their grains being infected with the fungus. Both of the aforementioned means of tripping have been around since the end of BC times, with potential for the practice's origination to be even earlier, like every other substance that we've discussed thus far. There's a long gap between the discovery of these last early drugs, such as opium and whatnot, before the advent of modern chemistry bringing about a whole sort of new compounds for people to play with, though in that gap is the technological evolution of distillation and concentration of alcohol, bringing about the first spirits. There is some very rough knowledge of distillation as early as 1200 BC with the ancient Babylonians, though it seems they only applied the science for matters of aromatic and medicinal production, as proper alcohol distillation would have likely been too advanced for the time. It's not until the late first millennium AD that we concretely know of the presence of spirits, thanks to the writings of Albertus Magnus, a medieval scientist and philosopher, who documented the process of concentrating ethanol for the first time. Just like with everything else so far though, it's difficult to determine even a rough timeline of when such techniques started being used, as the discovery of spirits likely came about independently across different regions of the world. That said, there is some tenuous evidence that Irish monks introduced distillation to Ireland sometime in the 6th century, where distilling barley beer would have brought about the first whiskey, though again, quite different from the whiskey of today. Befuddling enough though, if the legends really are true, and these traveling monks did indeed bring back their knowledge to Ireland to make whiskey, then where did they learn of the practice to begin with? Adaptation of slightly more advanced alcohol production didn't just bring about spirits though, it also introduced those in the right time and right place to diethyl ether. The synthesis of ether was first formally performed and documented by Prussian botanist Valerius Cortis in 1540, though there's a chance the drug could have been discovered as early as the 8th century, which wouldn't be too hard to believe, seeing as diethyl ether is merely made from reacting ethanol and sulfuric acid. Ether would go on to have a very long history, far too great for the matter of our humble timeline, but we'll touch upon it again in short time. Now that we've somewhat sufficiently delved into the proclivities of the people long before us, it's finally time to go over some more contemporary drugs, maybe some that you're even familiar with. This is going to be a lot quicker as we're basically just running down the timeline. There's not much to substantiate each drug with. You know, it's not like I'm pulling out the studies and trying to figure out a rough time span of when some ancient Mesopotamians were taking speedballs. It's safe, if not best, to assume people began taking these substances recreationally as soon as their effects were discovered, and the rest is history. The first modern drug, and one that's seen increasing popularity amongst today's youth, is none other than nitrous oxide. Innocently isolated in 1772 by Joseph Priestley, it didn't take long before another young chemist, Humphrey Davy, came along and self-experimented with the new gas, discovering whippets in of itself, or as the geriatrics may call call it, laughing gas. It'd be several decades before doctors began to experiment with nitrous oxide as an anesthesia, though it only took a few years before upper-class British chaps began to experiment themselves, with laughing gas parties apparently becoming all the rage by the end of the 18th century. Next up, a definitive favorite amongst those dying in hospital beds, morphine. First derived from opium in 1803 by a 21-year-old Friedrich Sertiner, the discovery marked the first opiate of many to come, although it wouldn't be properly synthesized, and by extension, its production scaled until nearly a century and a half later in 1952. Sertiner, like every other respectable scientist, tested his own creation on himself, where he obviously quickly realized the sedative effects of the drug. And so, following the line, he named the new substance morphium after the Greek god of dreams Morpheus. Unfortunately for Sertiner, despite his contributions to medical science, he himself was still only human, and the pharmacist lived out the rest of his days severely addicted to his own product. Following the isolation of morphine comes maybe the drug, at least for investment bankers and spring breakers. Of course, that being cocaine, which was isolated from cocoa in 1859 by Albert Niemann. Though funnily enough, it flew under the radar until the 1880s when Sigmund Freud tried it and personally took it upon himself to spread the word of its medicinal properties. Of course, it'd be a very short time before people decided that cocaine was less a cure for minor ailments and more for inhibition of any kind. 1887 saw the next popular psychoactive substance, something that I take nearly daily, as do most college students do, legally or illegally, amphetamine, or Adderall, thanks to Romanian chemist Lazar Adelinu. Initially named phenyl isopropylamine, it wouldn't be until 1927 when its effects would finally be revealed, thanks to another chemist, Gordon Ailes, synthesizing the drug and testing it on himself. The stronger sibling, one I definitely don't take, and more popular amongst copper harvesters and fascists, methamphetamine, which came just 6 years after in 1893. While the 19th century had seen the introduction of drugs so much as never even dreamed of before, the best is still yet to come. In 1898, Bayer Pharmaceuticals released their best over-the-counter pain reliever and cough suppressant yet, and better yet, it was non-addictive. This incredibly effective wonder drug was of course heroin, and it was sold as is until 1920, with the passage of the Dangerous Drug Act in the UK, which affected the accessibility of drugs across the world, but we'll get back to that bill in just a minute. Oxycontin came soon after heroin in 1906, and the famous party drug MDMA or Molly came in 1912. The next oxycodone, was derived from thebaine, which itself was derived from opium in 1916, though the famed Percocet wouldn't come until 6 decades later, which itself is just a combination of oxycodone and acetaminophen or Tylenol. Now it's around this time that scientists and governments began to pick up on the fact that the only kind of curing these medicines were doing was that of people's sobriety, and so thus the gears began to turn for what would become some of the first modern-day drug regulation. It was in 1912 that the first international collaboration against drugs would arrive through the aptly named 1912 International Opium Convention Treaty, though this is merely the first step of many, and the drug trade and consumption continued on relatively unabated. Before the days of serious crackdown would come though, desomorphine would be synthesized in 1920, right before the aforementioned Dangerous Drug Act. If desomorphine doesn't ring a bell, then maybe crocodile does, which is just an impure desomorphine solution. The reason behind desomorphine, or in today's case crocodile's popularity, is because of the accessibility of its production, only requiring codeine to start the synthesis. Of course, that process is quite dirty, requiring gasoline and other toxic solvents like paint thinner, which produces the results we've probably seen in users of the drug. Now, if you've ever heard of the term designer drug, it's a general umbrella term for synthetic compounds that are made to replicate the effects of a respective banned drug, and it's in the 1920s when we see the first designer drugs. The Dangerous Drug Act was among the first major, truly effective international action to clamp down on drugs, but just the year before, America saw the passage of the 18th Amendment, officially kicking off the prohibition. People still needed their drunk, even without ethanol, and so many turned to the aforementioned diethyl ether, which could very well be considered the first designer drug. It'd be the mid-1920s when the prevalence of designer drugs took on an exponential form, with the passage of the International Opium Convention Treaty of 1925, a significantly more effective piece of legislation than its predecessor, the 1912 Treaty. And it's not just because governments began to interfere in the status quo that novel drug production accelerated, but also the revolutionary advances in chemistry, or science as a whole really, that enabled new classes of drugs never even conceptualized before to become reality. For example, methadone was synthesized in 1929, officially establishing the subcategory of designer drugs known as bath salts, much to the appreciation of those who don't want to embarrass themselves with something meek like cocaine or methamphetamine. My personal favorite, not that I've had it or anything, it would be unintentionally discovered in 1938, LSD or acid, and the story behind it is also my favorite of these modern day drugs. So, Albert Hofmann worked in pharmaceuticals, and amongst his many work was that of lysergic acid derivatives, which meant heavy experimentation with organisms like ergot fungus. On November 16th of 1938, Hofmann unintentionally produced LSD while researching an analeptic safe for the uterus, although he put away the resulting products without much thought, believing his efforts to be futile. Upon returning to the project 5 years later and going about resynthesis, he accidentally absorbed a small amount of pure acid through his hand, to which he full-ass tripped, albeit only for a few hours compared to the usual 12 to 24 hours of a normal trip. Astounded, just 3 days later, on April 19th, Hofmann ingested the acid intentionally, about 250 micrograms, which is roughly equivalent equivalent to 1.5 to 3 tabs worth of acid, depending on the purity and dosage. He expected it to be a small dose, but it resulted in extremely vivid hallucinations, like furniture taking on life and people transforming into creatures. Too fucked up to drive, he rode his bike home, and now many celebrate April 19th as Bicycle Day, in honor of the man who made and experienced acid for the first time. Even with the burgeoning drug market, both medical and recreational, there were still whole new classes of drugs to come, and in the mid-50s, humanity was introduced to benzodiazepines, or just benzos. The foremost of these, that of chlordiazepoxide, which like many of the other substances on this list, was found by accident and disregarded for years. In 1955, Leo Sternbach was deep into his research on tranquilizers, and among the many failed products was the chlordiazepoxide. It was a couple years later when his co-worker Earl Reeder stumbled upon the crystallized compound within a mess of other failed endeavors and took a shine to it. His peers agreed, and so the substance was submitted into animal testing, not necessarily in pursuit of a new drug, but rather to derive potential novel chemical knowledge. Instead, it turned out to be crazy effective for inducing sedation, and so researchers rushed to produce more compounds within the same class for whatever respective reason. It's thanks to that in 1960, chlordiazepoxide is brought to the market as Librium, and just a few years later, so is Valium. The 1950s didn't just see the advent of benzos, but also some proper tweaker drugs, like none other than bencyclidine, or PCP. While it was initially discovered in 1926 through unscalable means, it was effectively synthesized in 1956 and quickly brought to the American market as a general anesthetic, though it brought about some nasty side effects, and so its administration in humans was banned in 1965. Despite so, PCP popped off almost immediately on the streets following its introduction, so much so in fact that the media referred to the substance as America's #1 drug problem, and a year after, a study revealed that at least 13% of high schoolers had tried the drug at least once. In the same year as the discovery of PCP's scalable synthesis, Stephen Czar extracted some dimethyltryptamine from a Mimosa hostilis tree, which while DMT had been first isolated in 1931, Czar was the first to consume the extract for himself, quickly finding out its effects. The 1960s saw the creation of some very relevant drugs today, maybe most of all, fentanyl, which was discovered in 1960 by Paul Janssen. Off-rip, its potency was known and feared, and so Western governments opted to wait a few years before allowing its introduction to domestic markets. The USA remained even more cautious, only allowing its usage in 1968 with some heavy stipulations. Of course, it'd be short time before street drug manufacturers caught wind of the substance, not only because of its potency, but its sheer ease of creation, making it a popular cutting agent going into the 80s. Just a couple years after the discovery of fent came Elon Musk's favorite drug in 1962, ketamine, which is a relatively tamer alternative to PCP, and thus replaced it soon after its discovery. And in the same year as ketamine synthesis, so came xylazine, or as the youth today may know it as trank, which is often mixed with fentanyl, producing those characteristic fentanylines that you've probably seen. It'd be a little bit more than a decade before something stronger than fentanyl was found, when in 1974, the Janssen Pharmaceuticals Company, the founder of course being the one who discovered fentanyl, synthesized carfentanil, which is 100 times stronger than normal fentanyl and 10,000 times stronger than morphine. The last, and probably least pertinent drug to be developed that's still enjoyed recreationally is that of tramadol, which was introduced in 1977. Just another basic, but still popular opioid. Though I would also like to give an honorable mention to THCP, a very rare, naturally occurring form of THC successfully isolated in 2019, which has a binding affinity 33 times greater than standard Delta-9 THC, though that doesn't quite mean the high from it is 33 times stronger than a typical Delta-9 high. While that may be the end of the more conventional drugs on this list, we can't also forget about some of the more unconventional means people take to reject sobriety. There's huffing solvents like gasoline and paint thinner, which contain compounds like benzene and toluene, which depress the central nervous system in a very roughly similar manner to ethanol. Or there's also inhalants such as Duster, which contain hydrofluorocarbons, most notably difluoroethane, which too depresses the nervous system, albeit in a more acute fashion. If one lives in a resource-deprived area, they could try their hand at smoking venom from a local creature, particularly scorpions. Folks will either throw scorpions on burning coals and inhale the smoke in real time, or dry the scorpion, crush it, and smoke it straight up, sometimes mixed with tobacco as well. For something more culturally relevant, there's lean, or as some may know it, purple drank, which is just a prescription-strength cough syrup, preferably with codeine and promethazine, mixed with a soda-like Sprite. Though of course, there's several ways in going about creating your own preferred drink. For those especially desperate to get high and willing to face some adverse effects in pursuit of such, there's nutmeg and Benadryl. For those who decide they're hard enough for a drug like nutmeg, one can consume several grams of the spice to receive a mediocre, if not outright distressing, psychedelic high from the merest descent within. And for the last drug tonight, there's diphenhydramine, or Benadryl, which acts as a deliriant when taken at a high enough dosage. And not just any deliriant, mind you. Benadryl has a reputation for its heroin trips, including reports of an enigmatic Hatman, a shadowy figure who will visit and observe those in their delirious state. It's unknown if this Hatman is antagonistic or friendly, or even just ambivalent, and more research needs to be done before we can make any definitive assessments of the Hatman's place in this world. As it should be evident by now, drugs are merely another aspect of the human condition, not just recreational drugs like this video has been dedicated to, but the very existence of compounds that alters one's state of being, for the better or worse, has allowed our race, the human race, to be where we are today. The Homo sapien desires many things, among them most of all, pleasure. And it just so happens that some, or maybe even many, like to derive their pleasure, at least in part, from drugs. That fix can be as simple as enjoying a cup of coffee in the morning, or an introspective evening joint, or as destructive as needing to stay perpetually high and taking any and all means necessary to do so. It's all part of the human condition. Now, if I may, I'd like to give some personal thoughts about this. Firstly, obviously this timeline isn't comprehensive. There are literally countless substances, whether prehistoric, historic, or contemporary, that could have been included. So while maybe I could have pulled out the studies on kratom and spice and whatnot, I think their exclusion is probably the best for the sake of brevity. Secondly, throughout the research of this video, I had to dig through a lot of studies as well as the opinions of researchers, and while I massively respect scientists who dedicate their lives to the study of our ancestors, or any scientific field for that matter, I do believe that we simply do not give enough credit to the fact that early humans, whether we're talking about pre-Homo sapiens or those who lived in the Neolithic, were very much like us, if not quite literally us. They too experienced the spectrum of emotions, desires, creativity, and all else that we might experience today. It's just that they lived in a different time. Many of these studies and opinions tend to take the more cynical route of any given finding. For example, when I talked about the Scythian bathhouses that used steam generated from cannabis, there is some debate over if Herodotus meant like actual cannabis leaves were being burned to make steam that gets people high, or if he was speaking literally when referring to the fact that they were using cannabis seed, as if they were just burning seeds and whatever little THC was present just drove some people a little bit loopy. And it's like, no dog, I think they're just trying to get a little bit fucked up and have some fun. Like, maybe we don't have to take the loose translation literally, you know? Of course, it is widely believed that those Scythians were indeed hotboxing their bathhouses, and the dispute is minor, but it is still there. And that kind of cynicism is present for just about every example that you can find of ancient drug use. I think I love the story of the European man who was buried with a stash in the Flaming Mountains so much for that reason. Several centuries before the first direct evidence of recreational weed usage, we have a man from Europe who found himself in the Far East with nearly 2 pounds of cannabis specifically selected for its high THC content. And people will be like, well, it must have been the healthiest looking plant for the hemp rope he wanted to make. And I do genuinely believe that the first time someone would consume a drug recreationally, it was probably right after its respective effects were discovered. Just like today, there were almost certainly people back then who consumed questionable substances. It's not like Native Americans would have discovered a crazy hallucinogenic plant and then everyone right there and then was like, nope, this plant is exclusively for our cultural practices, nothing more. No, I'm sure there are also delinquent teens sneaking out at night to go experiment in the jungle or whatever, you know, just like how a 16-year-old today may sneak out of the house to go smoke with their friends on the railroad tracks. We're really all the same. It's just different times and different environments. After all is said and done, I did thoroughly enjoy making this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching just as much. Obviously, this is still one of my first videos, so I'm still trying to figure out how to best go about things, but you know, hopefully this didn't come out too bad. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. If you have any and all criticism, please let me know. It doesn't even need to be constructive. You can just be cruel. All that's fine. All that said, thank you sincerely. Maybe we'll meet again, but until if then, be metal and save smoking.